In this lesson we are going to talk about physical camera, and there is no special camera object that comes with Maxwell. Maxwell Render uses standard Cinema4D camera, but in a limited fashion, as I will show you. Now, there are just two things that Maxwell takes from standard Cinema4D camera, and those one obviously are view itself, so whatever you're viewing through active camera will be taken into account in Maxwell Render. Now the second thing is, let me just get out from my main camera, and the second thing is this focus value, so this focus distance. So that's the only real parameter that is used by Maxwell Render. Now let me just collapse these menus we want to use, so we have a nice and neat layout, and it will be much more easier to understand this concept. These parameters here, which have these really cryptic names like f-stop or ISO, well, if you know a thing or two about photography, then you will feel right at home with this, but for the vast majority of you, I will presume that you have absolutely zero knowledge and will explain things in such manner. So the first and the most obvious question is, why would I even use these camera settings here with this seemingly complicated set of parameters? Well, the answer lies in the fact that with these guys here, you can replicate reality. So no need for hundreds of parameters, just for, in fact, for static images, you only need these three guys. Now, I will maybe say something that is not really technically correct, but I'm pretty sure you will understand better that way. Now, let me show you what you can actually achieve with these guys before we tackle them directly to see what they do and how they affect the final rendered image. So let's actually go to maybe this left view, and I will hide this camera just to have less visual clutter, and will once again utilize those superb painting skills. So let's draw a simple camera which is smaller than this existing one, so something like this. And I'm doing this because I want to show you some basic principles of photography, because these camera parameters here are exactly the same as ones that you can find on a real camera. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So in a real world, camera can only focus on certain objects, same as our eyes. For example, if you are watching this tutorial, you're probably focused on your display and everything outside is blurred, or everything behind the computer screen is blurred. So that is exactly how the camera operates also. So to simplify, let's say that we have a focus point exactly on our statue. So camera will focus itself on it. So let's say something like this. This will be a focus plane, and everything moving away from that plane in any direction will become increasingly blurred. And I'm really trying to simplify this. So after a certain point, something like this, everything here will be blurred, and this area here where your focus is, and this space between complete blurring, is called depth of field. I'm pretty sure you heard of this technical term, and we can shorten this to DOF, and most of the people use this DOF term. This is one of many aspects of a real camera, and that depth of field is mainly controlled by this f-stop guy. Okay, now another aspect is this ISO, which is basically a sensitivity setting. Now, this may seem a little bit abstract, but in a real camera, this setting determines how much that film or digital sensor is sensitive to a light that is coming from outside. So, in other words, it simply defines how bright the final image will be. And of course, many of you that are really experienced with photography will say, well, that's not really true, but do bear in mind that a lot of beginners are watching this. So that leads us to our shutter setting. What this guy is, it is actually a mechanical device inside the camera that is really opening and closing, and the duration of how much opened it is really determines also how much light will enter the camera, and it's mainly responsible for the amount of blurring. And let me just simplify this to maximum extent. So I'm pretty sure you saw one of those images where a light has once again a light bulb, when a light has a trail behind it. So that's what this shutter is responsible for. So for the amount and let's say duration of motion blur in the image. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now let me get rid of this little guy, and all these guys combined, this f-stop, this ISO, and this shutter, are responsible for exposure value. Now, this can be a little bit difficult to understand, so let me just simplify. Here, if you open a help file, at the very end of a Maxwell Render manual, you can see typical exposure values for a lot of different situations. And do bear in mind that ISO is set to 100, and then those exposure values really apply. So if this guy is not 100, you have to extrapolate a bit. One very good thing about Maxwell Render is that you don't have to set these three guys to produce this exposure value. You can simply log that value, and then if you will be changing this, the other ones will simply adjust itself automatically, but this exposure value will stay the same. And let me just reset this to default, and I will show you this in a real environment and real render. So let's first hit this environment tab, because we have to have some sort of environment, and the default is physical sky, and we can pretty much leave it at that. And as you can see, there is a huge amount of parameters, and let me collapse that scary one. And what you can actually do is choose your location. So in my case, I'm choosing my city like this, and of course you can set the time, and let's leave the time as it is. Now that means that Maxwell will now, as an environment, use a real physically correct sky that are a real replica of this location at this date and this time. That is absolutely superb. Now there is also a sun option, so if you enable sun, you'll get some additional controls, and let's leave it off just for a moment. So now we are sure that our scene will be illuminated because we have an environment. Now let's unhide our camera and enter our camera, and we will switch to our main perspective or render view. One very important thing and feature in Maxwell Render is this fire render, and to explain this, let's hit this engine tab, and I will collapse everything that is not relevant to us at this moment. So basically in Maxwell Render you have a real render engine that is responsible for final results when you want to do a final image, and then you hit this little guy, and that will start an external Maxwell Render application. But one nice feature that comes with Maxwell Render is this fire render. Okay, so this guy here and its settings. Great thing about fire render is that it is built into Cinema4D, so once enabled you will get a pop-up window which will render exactly what you are looking through your camera. So to simplify, this fire is a preview render which is good enough to give you a very good representation of final rendered image. Now let's enable it and see what we get, and we get a floating window, and you can already see something is going on, and as large as this window is, the render will be that large. Now you have a new icon here which simply says refresh, so if you made any changes that Maxwell is not aware of, such as this window scaling, then you will hit refresh. Otherwise it is pretty smart and will refresh automatically. So for example, if I increase this sampling level, it will detect that change and it will refresh accordingly. Now these two guys, this sampling level and quality, and these CPU threads, are basically a quality control. So if these numbers are low, the quality of the overall render is low, and this sampling level is the maximum level of quality that you want Maxwell to reach. We will talk about this later. This quality is obviously a quality control for that sampling level, and this is really important setting because currently, let me increase this to maximum, let's say not really maximum, let's say maybe 20, and this quality to maximum, and currently you can see it's rendering really slow, and that is what we don't want. But it's rendering slow because we are using just one CPU thread, so we are not using all the computing power we have. So if I increase this to maximum, you will see it will re-render again, and you will see it's rendering much faster. But do bear in mind, this can leave your machine a little bit non-responsive, especially if you are using other applications. Okay, this button is pretty much self-explanatory. A big red button means stop, and it's stopping, and this guy will simply save the image to any location you choose. So now, as you can see, we have a partially rendered image because we stopped it before it reached this sampling level, and this is the result. And obviously our object is not in focus, and focus is roughly somewhere around here, because you can actually read out those numbers, and these are blurred, so we have a depth of field going on in our scene. So let's fix that and put the focus exactly on our object. So let's exit the camera view, and you can set the focus by simply adjusting this little guy exactly on the object, or I think that much better idea is to simply drop that object into focus object slot, and then you will have that automatically, regardless if you move this guy or scale or do anything else. Now let's get back to our camera view and select the scene object, which is now indicating that fire render is active, and all that is needed for us to get that preview window is to hit this refresh. So let's see what we have now, and I will stop the render after a certain point because we don't want to lose valuable time. So let's say that maybe this is good enough, and please do know that I'm also recording, so rendering is not as fast as you would expect. And now our object, although this is not rendered all the way to desired quality here, we can obviously see we have this statue in focus. Now let's hit this output tab, and I will show you what these guys actually do in real world application. So now we have that depth of field roughly here. Okay, so our object is in focus. This is where blurring occurs, and this everything that goes away becomes increasingly blurred. So that is a really important concept. So we said that this f-stop is the main culprit for this blurring. So let's actually lower it to maybe 2 and let's refresh this and see what happens. And this is not what we want. And what happened here is that by changing the f-stop, we changed this exposure value. So effectively, we let a lot of light into our camera, and that is why this image is now completely blown out. So for everyone out there that is not experienced with photography, I suggest that you lock this exposure value. So first find this number. Okay, you can use decimal values. So let's say that 14 was okay, and let's try it out. And I think this is pretty good, and it's not overlit or underlit. Okay, let's stop this. Now, when this guy is locked, changing this value will not affect exposure because exposure is locked. It will change other two remaining values, which is also not really technically correct, but it will really give you a good idea. So if I put this to really low value, something like 1, and refresh, we will give it a second or two. You can clearly see now the effect of depth of field. Our object is in focus, but only a tiny portion is visible, and we can clearly read out those numbers. Now, when f-stop is low, then the depth of field is narrow. On the contrary, if you increase this to, let's say, 10, let's refresh that, that same depth of field will become wider. So lower means narrow, higher means wider depth of field. And as you can see, with higher f-stop, image is not blurred at all. Let's stop this. I think this is good enough. And what I also wanted to show you now, that changing this ISO will actually do nothing except just compensating through this shutter value. So if I double this to, let's say, 200 and refresh, you will have the same result. That is because we locked this exposure value. So if I uncheck this and then maybe change to higher value, you will see this exposure value is rising. So let's actually enter 400 and you will see much more different results. So you can see that now image is much brighter because we have let much more light in, because this is a sensitivity of that sensor inside, and we have so much light in the scene that this area of the image is blown out. Of course, you can lock that exposure value, and anything you do after that point will change other values to conform to this exposure value you want. So if I set this to 14, you will see this shutter value is changing. So if I set this to 100, you will see this shutter value is changing. And the good thing about it is that you can pretty much forget about this shutter value if you are doing still images. Okay, so if you're doing only static images, then just these three guys. Now let's hit refresh and see what do we have. And actually I will leave this to render completely to that sampling level of 20, so you will get a really good feel and idea how Maxwell produces fantastic results. And as you noticed, you don't have to set any samples, any specific things regarding to light, so just one single sampling level and quality, and that is what is really great. You don't have to set caustics or stuff like that. It's really that simple to use. So let me just briefly pause the video and I will be right back once this is rendered. And here we are after just a few minutes, and we have a nice rendered image, and look how effortless that was. So let me just briefly go over again of how a little we did to achieve this image. Let's actually minimize that, and what we did is that first we have set the focus point for our camera by placing this bust object. Then all we did is that we increased these two guys to maximum, and actually these two guys are only available if you are using fire render, so you can really reduce the render time for your previews, and for production engine that will export to Maxwell Render engine, you only have to set this sampling level. So isn't that fantastic? Absolutely effortless. And here in the output tab, I only increase this f-stop just a little bit, so this depth of field is a little bit wider. Okay, how about that? This is absolutely fantastic. So that is that advantage I was telling you about at the very start of this training. Now let me actually close this, and in our next lesson we will take a look at material creation, because that is a major component of rendered images.